contributions of Nannie Helen Burroughs. She is a powerhouse. She is absolutely a crucial person that reshaped Black women's labor activism in the early 20th century through her education, her advocacy, and her racial vision. She challenged both racial and gender barriers to empower Black women in the workforce, and these lessons still resonate today. And so, why is this even important? Why should we even care? Well, the Symposium is talking about the intersections of African American labor, gender, and activism. And from a historical perspective, in America, the contributions of Black women are demeaned, degraded, erased, and watered down. And they have been sidelined in the dominant labor narratives. Now, I'm going to be talking about three major sources. One of the sources is from Danielle Phillips Cunningham, who talks about how Burroughs' work positioned labor as both a site of oppression and resistance of Black women. She saw economic self-sufficiency as a site of radical acts, one that directly challenged white supremacy and patriarchal control. Similarly, Keisha B. Graves highlights that Burroughs' activism intersected with civil rights, education, and faith, making her multifaceted leadership significant in Black labor history. So the main things I'm gonna talk about to answer these questions, how did Nannie Helen Burroughs challenge racial and gender barriers in labor? How did she use education, faith, and activism to empower Black women? How do her strategies remain relevant in today's fight for labor and gender justice? She had a macro sociological and macro sociological perspective. She used Bible, she used language, she used education, she used the hands and the feet of those who are on the side of the oppressed to advocate for and practically fight for women's rights, women's dignity, respect, honor, and love. To fully understand anybody's contributions in history, you gotta start with the context. Any history of anybody throughout history without the context is insufficient because we all live in context. So, this is the early 20th century in America. At this time, Black women were systemically confined to low-wage and exploitative jobs, and we know that this still happens today, especially in other parts of the world. The majority worked as domestic servants, as laundresses, or agricultural laborers. These jobs that offer little economic mobility and reinforce racial and gender hierarchies. They had nothing, and they created something out of nothing. My favorite book is Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's book entitled Righteous Discontent. She's a scholar over at Harvard University. Been a scholar there since before I was thought of. And Black women, in her text, she talks about how Black women were undoubtedly marginalized by white society, which saw them as little more than a servant class, and by Black male leaders who often overlooked their labor struggles. Even within the growing labor movement, Black women were largely excluded from unions, leaving them vulnerable to unfair wages and poor working conditions. And despite these challenges, y'all, Black women were not passive victims. Black women never were passive victims. They organized, they had mutual aid, they created institutions for themselves, and they fought for fair wages, they resisted economic exploitation in powerful ways. It was within this context that Burroughs emerged and recognized that economic empowerment was key to liberation. And so, now you're probably saying, well, Powell, all right, that's cute, but what did she actually do? Well, she created the National Association of Colored Women. The National Association for Colored Women. This pushed for economic justice. Black club women and activists built schools. They built schools physically. They built schools with their own curriculum. They built schools with stolen textbooks. They built schools, training programs, mutual aid societies. Black club women and activists established schools and mutual aid societies and economic cooperatives to counteract the exclusion of Black women from labor protections. Burroughs emerged from a tradition of Black women who saw labor as a key site of racial uplift and collective empowerment. Now, she didn't just create an association. She created an actual school that's still in DC right now, founded in 1909, not 1950 something, not 1970 something, 1909. She founded the National Training School for Women and Girls. This gave Black women vocational and professional skills while giving them practical faith-based education for them to uplift and empower and encourage themselves on a spiritual level as well as a practical vocational level. Now, through these practical trades and business skills and leadership skills, they were able to build their own institutions in 1909. In founding this school, Burroughs was making a bold statement. She said that Black women's work mattered and they deserved the tools to control their own economic destinies without a man. The school trained women in skilled trades and business and directly challenged the idea that Black women were only fit for menial labor. Burroughs did not just teach skills though. She instilled an entire philosophy of economic independence that was equitable and that had ethical foundational principles. She believed that financial self-sufficiency was essential for racial progress, and if Black women could control their own labor and teach their own Black girls, they could free themselves from exploitation and contribute meaningfully to the advancement of their communities. She once wrote, "Well, the girl who can make a good loaf of bread is as valuable to the race as the girl who can write a good book," unquote. This statement was not about limiting women's ambitions. It was about valuing all forms of labor and ensuring that Black women took pride in their work, no matter their field. Her ideas directly challenged both white economic control and Black male dominance. Both white economic control and Black male dominance. As Kalisha B. Grace highlights, Burroughs was adamant that Black women should not have to wait for permission to enter any new economic space. She urged them to create their own opportunities and to demand fair wages and respect in all professions. And through Burroughs' advocacy, these women were positioned in labor settings with an uplifted spirit. A spirit where Black women can see Black women as economically successful and to translate that success to pass on to others. Well, how did she do that? Well, she wrote and she spoke and she taught. She wrote and she spoke and she taught. If you read anything by her, I would suggest reading this text called "How the Sisters Are Hindered from Helping" in 1900. This is a critique of sexism in Black leadership. This essay talks about how both white supremacy and sexism within the Black community exists. Burroughs said, quote, "The Negro man will not associate his women with himself in his struggles. She is rarely given any voice in shaping measures for the welfare of the race." With this, she made a bold statement. Black women were not supporters of the movement, they were leaders in their own right, unquote. Burroughs spoke on national stages. She advocated for better wages, for fair treatment, and for the recognition of Black women's labor. And she understood that true liberation required more than just racial solidarity. It required a fundamental shift in how Black women's labor is even seen, even valued and respected beyond ideology and prejudice. Let's get to here. Intersectionality. So intersectionality is a great way to approach most things. And so intersectionally, race, gender, and labor. Burroughs understood that labor struggles were not isolated from the other issues of race and gender. They were deeply intertwined, and she was among the first, one of the first Black women to articulate a labor philosophy that linked economic justice with racial and gender equality. If it wasn't for Nannie Helen Burroughs, there would be no Dorothy Height. If it wasn't for Nannie Helen Burroughs, there would be no Dorothy Height. This is just one example of someone who was one of her students. Dorothy Height. Who was Dorothy Height? Well, she was a main organizer for the March on Washington for freedom, for jobs and freedom in 1963. She was the president of the NCNW from 1957 to 1998. She worked with Eleanor Roosevelt, with Dwight D. Eisenhower, with Lyndon B. Johnson. Dorothy Height got a Presidential Medal of Freedom, but Dorothy Height got a Congressional Gold Medal. Dorothy Height is one of the most pivotal, most powerful women in American history, and there would not be a Dorothy Height if it wasn't for Nannie Helen Burroughs. Now, this presentation is more than just one woman, but it's about all the women that's in our lives, that there would not be a you if it wasn't for some woman. There would not be a me here if it wasn't for Dr. Lane and for my mom and for all the other Black women that have poured into me. And so I encourage you to have an intersectional approach about your own life and about whatever you care about, whatever your research is. Know that education is liberation. Know that community requires some level of solidarity, and that economic justice is the foundation for the freedom and the upliftment of Black women. Now, lastly, how do we continue Burroughs' legacy? Well, skill-based organizing. We need to know how to use our hands and our hearts and our heads. Local leadership. Act locally, think globally. Challenge the system and not the symptom. Challenge the system and not the symptom. And then lastly, but not leastly, know that all education is inadequate if you're not passing it on to somebody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. I'd like to open the floor to questions, comments, concerns. Someone left their phone up here.
That's mine.
Okay. Questions, comments for any of the panelists or the group as a whole? Yes, sir.
You're my CEO. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Wonderful. Any other comments, questions? Feedback? Perhaps one thing? Yes. Go ahead, Derek.